Right now, somewhere in your kitchen, there is probably a stove you have never once thought about as a survival tool. You use it to heat leftovers. You use it because raw food tastes worse. But the real reason you cook is far stranger than taste, and it has nothing to do with flavor at all. Every human culture on Earth cooks its food. Not most cultures, all of them. No exceptions have ever been documented anywhere at any point in recorded history. Compare that to language, which splits into thousands of different forms depending on where you're born, or clothing, or religion, all of which vary wildly from one group to the next. Cooking doesn't vary. It's universal in a way almost nothing else about being human is. And here's the detail that should actually unsettle you. Your body cannot survive without it. Not prefers not to. Cannot. Give a modern human a diet of nothing but raw food, and something measurable starts to go wrong. Your jaw is too weak for it. Your gut is too short for it. Somewhere in your evolutionary past, your entire body was quietly rebuilt around the assumption that fire would get to your food before you did. So when did that bargain begin? And what did it cost your ancestors to make it? To understand that, rewind about 2 million years to a point where our lineage looked almost nothing like it does now. Australopithecus, an early upright relative of ours, ate the way a wild chimpanzee still eats today. Raw fruit. Tough roots, bark, shoots, the occasional grub. Nothing was heated, nothing was softened, and the cost of that diet was time, an almost absurd amount of it. A wild chimpanzee spends close to half its waking hours simply chewing, grinding down fibrous plant matter mouthful by mouthful, because raw food surrenders its calories slowly and only through mechanical effort. Harvard primatologist Richard Wrangham didn't just study this from a lab. He went to Uganda and tried living on what wild chimpanzees eat. His own description of the experience was blunt, exhausting, bitter, barely worth the effort for the energy it returned. That first-hand frustration led him somewhere important. He became convinced that a body like ours with a comparatively weak jaw and a short gut simply could not run long-term on that ancestral raw diet. Not that we wouldn't enjoy it, that we couldn't survive on it. Which raises an obvious question. If your ancestors' bodies couldn't function on what earlier hominids ate, what changed? What suddenly made food deliver enough energy to support a shorter gut and a weaker jaw? Wrangham's answer arrived, of all places, while he was sitting by his own fireplace in 1997. Cooking. Not a growing taste for meat. Not tool use. Not bigger brains inventing cleverer ways to forage. Cooking itself arriving first. Probably by accident, and reshaping the body afterward. He published the idea formally in 1999, and it became known as the cooking hypothesis. The claim is almost the reverse of how most people assume evolution worked. We didn't get smart and then discover fire. We started applying heat to food, and our brains grew because of it. To see why that argument holds up, look closely at what heat actually does to food, because the mechanism is hiding in plain chemistry. Take a raw root or grain. Its starch is locked into dense granules your digestive enzymes can barely break into. Heat forces those granules to absorb water and swell open, a process called gelatinization, and suddenly the same food yields dramatically more usable energy. Protein goes through something similar. Raw meat is held together by tough fibers that resist stomach acid. Heat unravels those fibers through a process called denaturation, turning them into strands your body can break down with far less effort. Heat also destroys a share of the natural toxins and pathogens sitting inside raw food the defensive chemistry plants and animals carry to make themselves harder to eat. And there's a fourth effect, the one responsible for why cooked food tastes like an entirely different substance. The Maillard reaction, the browning that happens when heat meets sugars and proteins on a food's surface, producing entirely new compounds that didn't exist in the raw version. Put all four together and cooking stops looking like a matter of taste. It looks like outsourced digestion. Fire does a real share of the chemical work before food ever reaches your mouth, which means your gut spends far less energy finishing the job. And that savings shows up somewhere very specific in the fossil record. Around 1.8 million years ago, something fairly sudden appears in the bones we've dug up. Homo erectus shows up with a noticeably larger brain relative to body size, longer legs, and, critically, a smaller jaw and a visibly shorter gut. That shrinking gut may be the single most telling change in our entire lineage. Most primates carry a large, expensive digestive tract built for slowly fermenting huge amounts of tough plant matter. In Homo erectus, that expensive system shrinks, and there's only one real explanation for how a species affords that. Whatever it was, eating required far less processing to deliver the same energy. Here's why that trade-off matters so much. Your brain right now, sitting quietly in your skull, is burning close to a fifth of your entire body's energy just to idle, gram for gram, roughly 9 times more expensive to run than muscle. It is the single most costly tissue you own, and it demands a steady, calorie-dense diet to stay powered. Brazilian neuroscientist Susana Herculano Housel actually ran the math on what a raw food diet would cost an animal trying to grow a brain our size. A gorilla, she found, would need several extra hours of feeding stacked onto the 8 or 9 it already spends daily, pushing total feeding time past 10 hours a day, leaving almost no time for anything else. On raw food alone, a large brain simply doesn't fit the budget. There's experimental support for this too, not just fossils and math. In a study run alongside Wrangham, mice fed cooked meat gained noticeably more weight than mice fed the exact same amount of raw meat, with every other variable held constant. The only difference was whether fire had touched the food first. Not every researcher agrees on the full picture, and it's worth being honest about that. The expensive tissue hypothesis argues the real shift wasn't specifically cooked starches, but calorie-dense food in general, including raw meat and marrow. Other researchers point to growing social complexity, not diet alone, as the bigger driver of brain growth. Most now suspect several of these forces reinforced each other rather than any single one acting alone. The archaeological timeline adds its own wrinkle. If cooking became essential 1.8 million years ago, clear evidence of controlled fire doesn't show up until much later. Burned bone and ash in a South African cave date to roughly 1 million years ago. A site in Israel called Qesem Cave shows something more convincing still, a hearth reused repeatedly somewhere between 3 and 400,000 years ago, next to bones that were cut and heat-treated, suggesting a dedicated cooking spot rather than the occasional lucky fire. Some researchers find the gap between 1.8 million years and this later evidence troubling. Others point out that small, open-air fires rarely survive the geological record at all, so the silence may reflect what fossilizes, not what actually happened. What isn't up for debate is what happens to a human body denied cooked food today. Long-term studies of people eating a strictly raw diet consistently show steady, unavoidable weight loss because the body burns more energy processing raw food than it gets back from it. Close to half the women studied on a strict raw diet stop menstruating altogether within a matter of months, a direct signal that the body has judged its energy supply too unreliable to support reproduction. A diet that shuts down reproduction in roughly half the people attempting it isn't a lifestyle choice. It's a route to extinction within a single generation. And there's a social layer to all of this that goes beyond biology. A fire has to be tended, defended, kept alive through the night, and that need forces people to gather around it and depend on each other. Someone tending the flame while another forages holds a real advantage over anyone trying to survive entirely alone. Some researchers argue this is where a working division of labor between partners first took root. Not romance, but a practical arrangement built around a shared hearth. And once people are sitting together at night, fed, safe from predators, with hours of non-chewing time suddenly available, something else becomes possible. Talking, teaching, passing down which plants are safe and which valley has water. The fire didn't just feed the brain, it built the first conditions for the brain to actually use everything that exercise was for. So the next time you're standing at your stove, waiting for something to finish cooking, or scraping a burnt pan out at midnight, take a second to notice what you're actually doing. You are repeating the single oldest technology your species has ever practiced, older than farming by roughly 1 million years, older than written language, quite possibly older than language itself. You are carrying out the exact act that shrank your jaw, shortened your gut, freed your ancestors' time, and paid for the very brain you're using to understand this sentence right now. That stove was never just a kitchen appliance. It's the reason you exist at all.